Hello there and welcome back to the channel. Today, the Imperial Starfleet, a history of war and conquest. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe and comment down below. And tell me who you prefer, regular old boring Federation Starfleet, or by the end of this video, what we know about the horrific, glorious and deadly Imperial Starfleet of the Terran Empire. The Imperial Starfleet of the Terran Empire was founded, similar to its Prime Universe counterpart, in the early 22nd century. Its primary role was that of military oppressor and advancement of the Terran Empire. Its goals ultimately were to serve the Terrans and to expand their imperial goals, and to spread a human culture across the Alpha and Beta quadrants as fast as their warp nacelles could carry them. The Imperial Navy of this era, of the mid-22nd century, was a combined force that included Starfleet and Mako personnel serving as ship security. They would be involved in several waves of severe and brutal military expansion. The flagship of Starfleet was the ISS Enterprise NX-01, an NX-class battlecruiser. This vessel was destroyed by the Tholians in 2155, but this barely slowed Starfleet down, although they did have a few minor rebellions from some other conquered species, such as the Vulcans and Andorians. The Empire would continue to expand and grow, with Starfleet being the tip of the spear, or the sword in the case of the Empire. Starfleet was by no means a peacekeeping organization in this reality. Its primary role was that of conqueror and defender of the Empire, its naval assets often working independently of one another or in small assault groups where more greater force was needed. They would have several notable conquests early in their stages of the Empire, which would involve the conquest of Vulcan, the conquest of Andoria, the annexation and subjugation of the Denobulans, the Tellarites, the Rigelians, and a number of other species. By the late 22nd century, the Empire was already considerably larger than the Federation was at that time, and was expanding rapidly in all directions, sometimes a little recklessly. Starfleet, as an organization, was for the most part a disciplined military force, but was known for cutthroat internal rivalries and ruthlessness. But Terrans had an ability to come together when they needed to against a common threat, but without a common threat, quite often different admirals and their task forces, or sometimes even captains, would take their vessels and their ships and make a play for greater power within the Empire. Although it is a bit of a cliche, it was possible to advance in rank within the Empire through means of assassination and simply removing your predecessor and replacing them. Although this does imply a buccaneer-style culture, it is not entirely that simple. You still had to justify what you did. There was a chain of command for a reason, and if you wanted to get to anything above captain, you had to be able to play the political game a little more than you did have to be able to knife your fellow crew members in the back to advance in rank. It only tended to happen aboard ill-disciplined crews or captains who commanded ships without honor, or without really pushing the objectives of the Empire and allowing their subordinates either an opportunity or possibly even a genuine reason to advance and replace them. Starfleet would also be responsible for multiple brutal military atrocities, such as the orbital bombardment of the Klingon homeworld Kronos, the complete extermination of the Gorlan, the devastation of the Harlak, as well as various other brutal military conquests, such as the conquest of the Betazoids. The Terrans' typical military practice of Starfleet was not to negotiate, but simply to absorb another power, and if that power resisted, destroy it. If a race was willingly, or at least somewhat willingly, absorbed into the Terran Empire, however, they could actually thrive within it, notably with some of their species even being able to join Starfleet's more respected races such as Andorians and Orions. It was possible for them to advance in rank, even becoming captains of Starfleet ships themselves, although this was relatively rare. Lesser species of the Empire, such as Tellarites, would only work in the capacity of enlisted personnel, basically the lowest ranks of the ship, crewmen and general technicians and engineers, who were treated little more than slave disposable forces aboard the starships, cannon fodder troops to be used against the Empire's enemies. Starfleet as an organisation would continue to expand and evolve and grow, developing new classes of starship and advancing in technology rapidly throughout the 23rd century, until it eventually culminated in a war between the Klingon-Cardassian alliance that would see Starfleet destroyed in the late closing years of the 23rd century. Although more specifically this saw an end to the Terran Empire, it's not confirmed that Starfleet as an organisation and entity simply ceased to exist at this point, and may have carried on in some reorganised form in and of itself as a subject force of the Klingon-Cardassian alliance. In terms of military structure throughout its history, Starfleet was organised much like a familiar military would be in our reality. At the top you had admirals, generals, marshals and other such leaders. Below them you had the various attachés and subordinates, and in the fleet personnel you would have ranks such as captain, commander and others, and amongst the MACOs you started to have ranks like colonel, general, major, other such things. Particularly aboard starships you'd likely have had a major or possibly a colonel in charge of the MACOs aboard the ship. General command structure, as I said, was basically very similar, but they did have a habit of really packing them in on Terran vessels versus the Federation. Now again, there was this sort of feeling of buccaneer style culture, and to a degree it was true. The Terrans were a hyper-violent people, and Starfleet tended to attract the most violent and the most ruthless amongst the Terrans to its ranks, and tended to promote the most aggressive officers, whether this be, as I said, through the relatively rare, but did happen, assassination method, or simply getting rid of your captain in some other unfortunate way, or more likely you would progress through the ranks through a more normal way, such as officers like Sulu and Chekhov ultimately would do, despite they would take advantage of other opportunities that presented themselves. But quite frankly, to me anyway, being a captain in Starfleet wouldn't be a very desirable position if you had the realization that everyone from your first officer down was looking to kill you so they could advance in rank. There doesn't seem to be any upsides to that. Not if you intend on staying in that role. People like Kirk used such vicious tactics to keep his crew in line, he actually basically was endorsing this kind of cutthroat behaviour, whereas a captain like Forrest, one of his predecessors from 100 years earlier, seemed to cultivate a crew loyalty. And although Archer would ultimately turn on him, Archer never went out of his way to actually kill Forrest, merely to advance his own agenda. Although it wouldn't have been beyond Archer to have killed Forrest, it wasn't seemingly part of his initial plan. He merely wanted to demonstrate that he was worthy of command, and wanted to see a mission through that he felt would actually save the Empire from its enemies. Ultimately, Terran officers were loyal soldiers of the Empire. Even if they weren't necessarily always 100% loyal to each other, they saw the greater glory of the Terran Empire as something that they did want to adhere to. And quite frankly, any Terran that was weak enough to allow you to outthink them, outmaneuver them, outsmart them, or simply kill them, and wasn't worthy of the position which they held. And this was survival of the fittest in the Empire after all. Starfleet, bottom line, was much more like how the Klingon feudal empire or the Klingon defense force of the Prime Universe operated, with this sort of, as I say, feudal-like system of how they operated and ran things. But they were still a martial culture, and the Terrans did have an adherence to a strict command structure, which was familiar to its Prime Universe counterparts, if a little more aggressive and vicious. So as I said, there we have it. The Imperial Starfleet. Some of its highlights and accomplishments. I may do a few more videos breaking down some of the individual battles and instances of the Empire, but those will be later. This is a broad overview of the Imperial Starfleet of the Terran Empire. Let me know in the comments below where you stand on the Empire. Do you think it's realistically that it was possible for every ship in the fleet to constantly be in this situation where every crew member was trying to replace the captain and kill them? Or do you think there was some kind of more of a balanced culture between the two? I just want to take this moment to thank you for watching that video. If you liked what you saw, please check out my social links in the description box below to Instagram and Twitter and others. And also is down there a link to my Patreon page where you can support this channel and the others as I try to grow this franchise and do this more regularly. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching and bye bye.